Hello, it's Pete Vanderbeek here, specialized transitional minister, and I'm in a time in the middle of the pandemic days where I'm entering a phase of being between contracts, and so that gives me some opportunity to create more video content in terms of just documenting, sometimes even for myself. It's helpful to think these things through out loud, some of the things that I've learned in this work. So um, in the works is a video about what does a specialized transitional minister do, because that'll be a handy one to link people to if they are curious about what I do for a church. But this one is about size dynamics in congregations. That's primarily what I want to share, and it too, like the other series, will be broken down into shorter videos. As I'm learning this YouTube thing, I'm beginning to understand that people don't um, don't seem to take to long, instructional anyway, kinds of videos. So to start laying this out, I need to start with systems. As a specialized transitional minister, I take what is called a systems approach to the churches I serve. As a society, so as a culture in general in North America, we are moving out of a time when the emphasis in understanding how things worked was based in a linear cause and effect understanding of how things worked. That's one big philosophical statement, and I'll just let that stand for itself. That understanding was closer to thinking only technically about organizations like churches. We thought of them as similar to machines, as technical sets of cause and effect events. And we even have metaphors, we have phrases that we use to describe that. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? That's a machine. It starts squeaking, you just got to figure out where to put the grease to make it not squeak again and to work properly. So even our language reflects this way that we've been thinking about the church. So there is where you get, and there's tons of those out there, seminars and books titled 12 Technical Steps to a Healthier Church, in which 12 things are laid out. Puts a little bit of grease here, put a new gear in here, hire a church administrator, hire a worship team, and suddenly your church will be running better. Systems thinking, as I understand it and attempt to practice it, looks at a congregation not as a machine, but as a living organism, a living thing, not a machine. It's a huge difference, really. At risk of making this video longer than I intend, I do a lot of thinking about the difference between the institutional church and the body of Christ. The Bible gives us the image of the body of Christ as that being what true believers in Jesus become part of as they live out their faith. And it doesn't really say that much about, there are institutional things required, but it's not primarily an institution. And so I've seen many, many times where the needs of the institutional church start stifling what the body of Christ needs to do. Different video, different time. So each congregation is a living organism which has its own set of interwoven relationships. So earlier I went cause and effect, like pool balls bumping into each other and making them move different places. But now we're talking about interwoven in many different ways relationships. Let me just name 3 potential levels of how this works. Biological, philosophical, and emotional. Just 3. There are so many more, and maybe I should really add history as well, or historical. So I'll do 4. And when something happens, say someone complaining to the pastor about an error in the bulletin, many layers of these relationships can be in play. They are mostly invisible in the event itself of the person complaining. Let me try and I'm just making this up. Apply each of those 4 that I mentioned to the bulletin error example. Biologically, the person complaining might be wired to be very annoyed with things being out of order, right? It's actually a positive thing that they have, but they're just wired that they can't stand it if a word is spelled wrong somewhere, and they're not at ease until it's fixed. That's biological, or I'll call it biological. Philosophically, in their worldview, they might believe that the church should be perfect and not make mistakes. And so the church has shown a flaw in having a mistake in the bulletin. And emotionally, in that moment, they might be upset because they had an argument with their spouse, and some energy around that needs to be vented somewhere. Historically as well, their sister used to do the bulletin, and this person that's complaining believes that she was moved out of that role unfairly. Can you see some of the effect that might create in them? So all those layers, I've only mentioned 4, might be active in one complaint. And that is not any more direct cause and effect. It is a web of causes producing one singular event. And I've learned that if you try and put grease on that event and soothe the person, there will be another fairly soon after, until you understand systems. Within a system, in systems thinking, again, as I understand it, each person has a role to play. And so I'm speaking mostly of church, so it has a role they play in church. Churches, a lot of systems thinking started with families, with a guy named, with the last name of Murray, who wrote some stuff about how this works in families. But really, a church is usually a collection of various kinds of family units. So the same principles just expand into that. So the person in my example, should I mention to someone else from that church that they were upset about the bulletin, might say this: oh, so-and-so, they are always complaining. That is their role in the church system. It can be really fun to play that back to a person and say, so you must have the role of being the all-around complainer in the congregation. You have to have the right setting for that and the right level of trust. But there you go. I once had it where I had a retired farmer who loved reading deep theological stuff, Kuyperian stuff, and loved having theological conversations after the church service ended. And but what he would do in his body language when we did that was he would get excited, and he had very long, strong arms and a rather short body, and so he'd get it so intense that he'd come closer and closer while his arms were waving, and instinctively, everyone that I saw this happen to, you kind of step back, and I did it myself. You just step back, you back off. And it would happen every time. And so one time I thought, what if I changed the roles here? I didn't know much about this stuff yet, but I just had this impulse because I have that now and then. What if I switch this up? And so the more excited he got, positively excited, although from a distance it would look like he was angry with me, The more excited he got and the more he came towards me, the more I leaned in. And it was very interesting. We ended up about 5 inches apart, nose from nose, looking into each other's eyes, and he dropped his arms, stopped talking, and walked away. The role had been broken of whatever was going on there. Okay? So each person has a role within the system. I was first shown this by a recovering alcoholic in one of the churches I served early in my pastoring. And this person came in and did a presentation on it in the church. And my learning about that was confirmed when I worked for a while at an addiction treatment center. What they learned over time is that you can take an addict, an active addict, out of a home, out of a family setting, and you can help them get clean and sober. But if the family system has not been adjusted once they come back into it, that person will be active in their addiction in a very short time. It was very frustrating for those who had to confront that. Why? Because the whole family system's roles were all configured to work around the addict being in their role. And no one showed them how to be sober from that pattern around the addict. And so the treatment center that I worked at for a time insisted they wouldn't take a patient unless the family agreed to come in, or key family members agreed to come in for a week of evening lessons themselves about how to change the family dynamic once the addict was in recovery and came home. So this is a much bigger preface than I intended, but it's important and it's a necessary understanding that underpins a lot of what I do and what I hope to share in these kinds of videos. Here's the key thing for today. The size of a congregation allows for a certain set of roles that seems to be consistent for that size of a group. And that has very important implications for the role of pastor in each size of church. What I'm sharing now, of course, is only then looking at one slice of the complexity of a congregation. And that slice is how size affects power dynamics and power possibilities, influence possibilities, which affects what role the pastor can play. I have found that congregations I've had the opportunity to share this with have been astonished to hear it and have affirmed it as consistent with their experience. And they go, wow, yeah, this makes so much sense. And it's happened most in family-sized churches that they recognize something out of having learned this, out of me having shared this with them. When I took my training in transitional ministry from what's called the Interim Ministry Network, they pointed me to material from Arlin J. Rothauge called Sizing Up a Congregation. So that's where my learning began on the academic end of it. The book Beginning Ministry Together by Roy Oswald also works with these ideas. And more recently, Reverend Tim Keller has an article online where he also talks about size dynamics. So if you do a search for Tim Keller, Reverend Tim Keller, and size dynamics, you can find that PDF document and read his take on it all. I'm pointing that out to say those are other people that have spoken of this, and I'm now telling you what I learned and how I've seen it to be true. So the way this theory, this principle, this idea works is that there are in general, in a very general sense, 4 size categories, with each of them, by virtue of their size and culture or power dynamics, will have a limit or an expansion of what the pastor is able to do and what the pastor should be doing. And so the 4 are family size church, which is congregations of 50 or fewer active members. So not what's on the membership roll, but people actively involved and participating. And again, it's not a hard and fast line. It's just a boundary. Second one is pastoral sized. And those churches tend to have between 50 and 150 active members. When they move beyond 150 active members, then you move to what's called a program size church. So it's between 150 and 350. And then the last one, the largest category, is corporate size, and they're anywhere over 350 active members. So each has its own characteristics and power dynamics. I've only served or worked with the smaller two categories, so I have most to say about them. And I'm going to create a video for each of the first two, and then one where I briefly describe the two larger ones, just so that can be available as well. Most studies show that breaking the 200 barrier for a church is one of the hardest things. So that's moving from a pastoral size to a program, pastoral. That's halfway through or it's just into the program size. And a lot of churches seem to hit a glass ceiling there at around 200 and can't break through. And it might have to do with how this particular thing works. One thing to say here is that churches can have a very difficult time moving from one category to the next one, either up as they grow or down as they shrink, as most churches are doing these days. As the size change from one to the other will affect the dynamics, while the expectations remain in the old set. Many troubles in a church have surfaced in situations where a family-sized church has succeeded in growing to a pastoral-sized one without understanding how the expectations they can have of the pastor need to change, or without the pastor understanding how their role needs to change, and they burn out and go down in flames. And the other way around, when a church has shrunk back to a family size from a program or a pastoral size, and all they can remember is the good old days when we had 3 youth groups and a young adults group and 5 worship teams, and you know how that litany goes. When we had X, Y, and Z as programs. Neither church is, because of the losses they've experienced and not acknowledged, able to really live in its true size. Okay, that's long enough. And so now my next video, I'll explain the dynamics of the family-sized church.